This is the single most important unit of this course. If you haven't been already, now is the time to start paying attention. I'm going to take a little detour from the class project and show you exactly how to use the graph editor inside of After Effects. So let's get started. Now we get to talk about what this whole class really is about: smoothing out your animations. I've set up a little demo to explain a little bit about how After Effects handles motion between its keyframes. I've animated this dot's position across the screen with just 2 keyframes. This trail that it's leaving behind is a representation of every frame of its motion. If I step back 1 frame at a time, you can see that these outlines are exactly where that dot was on every frame between those 2 keyframes. Right now it's just a linear movement from point A to point B. The dot travels at a constant speed. It's pretty boring. One of the most common ways of smoothing out animation in After Effects is using the built-in Easy Ease preset. And if you're familiar with animation at all inside of After Effects, you've probably used this before. So let's take a look at what that does to our animation. I'm going to select both of my keyframes by clicking and dragging a box around them, and then I'll right-click on one of the keyframes, go to Keyframe Assistant, and choose Easy Ease. And immediately you can see that our trail is updated. Now there are more outlines bunched up at the front and the tail end of the animation, and more spread out in the middle. If I play this back, you can see that the dot takes a little bit more time to speed up into its motion and then slows down more gradually at the end. For many After Effects users, this is where they stop. They just apply the Easy Ease preset, call it good, and move on to the next thing. But you're taking this class so you can learn how to not be like every other After Effects artist and take control of your motion. So I'm going to show you how to completely customize this motion using After Effects Graph Editor. To open the Graph Editor, you come down to the timeline and click on this button right here. Whatever property you have selected in your timeline will show up in the Graph Editor. So I'll click on my position value, and a curve appears in my Graph Editor. I'm going to give myself a little more room so we can see what's going on here. There are 2 different types of graphs inside of After Effects. By default, After Effects is going to choose the one that it thinks you want to use based on the type of property that you're editing. This is called the speed graph, and it's displaying the speed of this dot over time. So at the beginning of our animation, our dot isn't moving, so the speed value of the dot is 0, and you can see 0 pixels per second at the bottom of this little window. If we scrub through to the middle of the animation, our curve is shot up, and at the top of the curve, it's traveling at about 1530 pixels per second. And then if we scrub further to the end, it comes back down to a rest at 0 pixels per second. These 2 dots on either end of the animation are the keyframes that we set back in our original timeline. You can manipulate these keyframes to adjust the speed of the dot over time. These handles allow you to adjust the influence that each keyframe has on the speed curve. So if I were to click and drag on this handle and pull it towards the left, you can see that the influence percentage is increasing. At the same time, if you look up in the comp window, you can see that the outlines of every frame are bunching up towards the end of the animation, and that's because we're modifying our speed curve. If I let go here, we can actually predict the speed of the dot based on the curve. Right around 7 frames is where the dot is going to be traveling the fastest, at around 3100 pixels per second. So if I play this back, you see now that the dot takes much less time to take off and slows down much more gradually. It's a completely different feel. And if I were to grab this handle as well and drag that all the way out, now there's a point in our animation where outlines aren't even overlapping. If I preview this animation, you can see that the dot is traveling extremely fast in the middle of our animation and takes a while to start up and to slow down. Now let's say I didn't want my animation to start at a resting position. I'm going to set my keyframes back to Easy Ease by drawing a box around them to select them and then clicking on this button for Easy Ease. Then I'll increase the speed of my first keyframe by clicking and dragging it upwards. If I start it at around 1500 pixels per second, we can see that our curve is making a constant arc down to a resting position, but starting pretty quickly. If I preview this, our animation reflects that curve. You can see that it starts out fast and is constantly decelerating to a resting position. If I grab this keyframe speed influence, I can exaggerate this even more. But since I increased the influence of this speed handle, the speed at the start is actually not the fastest point anymore. To make sure my curve constantly decelerates, I'll grab this influence handle and turn it all the way down. And the highest point of the curve will always be the first frame. Let's preview that. And now we have an extremely fast moving dot that slows down to a resting point. Now, like I said before, there are 2 different types of graphs inside of After Effects. I've heard some people talk about the speed graph like it's the worst thing in the world, and I've heard this exact same thing about the other type of graph. 9 times out of 10, I personally use the speed graph. Most of the time it does exactly what I need it to, and I have as much control over my motion as I need. But I'm going to go ahead and show you the other type of graph because it is a little bit more versatile and lets you do the same thing but in just a little bit different way. So first I'm going to set my keyframes back to linear by selecting them both, holding Option or Alt on a PC, and clicking on one of the keyframes. Now we have our linear motion represented by a straight line on our speed graph. If I come down to this little icon here and click on it, I can choose to edit my value graph instead of my speed graph, which right now is set to auto select. If I choose value graph, our graph is a little bit different now. The biggest difference is that we have two different lines instead of one. These two lines are representing the two different axes of the position value. Now the way that we have our position value set up now, I can't edit these graphs' influence handles. I have to separate my X and Y position values into their own properties. To do that, I'll right-click on position and say separate dimensions. Now I can select the two different axes independently of each other. My animation of this dot is only moving on the X-axis, so I can actually get rid of the Y position keyframes by clicking on this stopwatch. That way we can just worry about the X position value. So if we take a look at this graph, now we've got a straight line going in an angle. Instead of representing speed, this line is representing a value. So what it's saying is at frame 0, our X position of this layer is set to 130 pixels, because that's where it happens to be in the composition. Now my comp's width is set to 1280 pixels, so the far left side of my comp would be a value of 0, and my far right side would be 1280. So this line is saying that at frame 0, X position is set to 130 pixels. And at the end of the animation, this layer's X position is set to 1150 pixels. And because the keyframes are set to linear, our graph is a straight line, which proportionally spaces out every frame equally. So in our speed graph, this is represented by a straight horizontal line, and in our value graph is represented by an angled line. Now, if I were to reverse these two keyframes, by selecting them, right-clicking, going to Keyframe Assistant, and saying Time Reverse Keyframes, now our dot travels on the opposite direction, and if I go back into my graph editor and look at just the X position, our graph's angle has now switched to being the opposite direction. That's because at the start of the animation we're now on the right side, and at the end of the animation we're on the left side. I'll undo this to get back to our original animation. Now let's see what happens to this curve if we apply the Easy Ease by coming down to this button. So just like before, our animation is updated to have more frames at the beginning and the end of the animation, and less in the middle. And instead of having an arch like our speed curve did, we now have an S-shaped curve. Now that I have handles on each one of my keyframes, I can adjust my curve. And just in the same way that I adjusted my speed curve, increasing the length of this handle will bunch up more of the frames towards the end of the animation. And if we kind of read this curve, we can see that that makes sense. At the beginning of the animation, the value is pretty low, and not too far into it, it starts picking up to be a higher value, and starts to level out right around frame 15, which is halfway through the animation. The rest of the animation has pretty similar values. So the dot comes to a gradual stop. If I preview this, you can see what's happening. If I bring this handle in to the left, we again will exaggerate this motion even more. So at this point it doesn't really seem like there's any benefit to use the value graph over the speed graph. But here's what the value graph can do that the speed graph can't. I'll set my two keyframes back to Easy Ease, and let's say I want to animate this to be a little bit more cartoony. I'm going to back up to around frame 25 and set a new keyframe at this point by switching to the pen tool up here, or by pressing G on the keyboard. Then I'll click on this point to add a new keyframe. Because we have a new keyframe, we have new handles that we can adjust. I'll switch back to the selection tool by clicking up here or pressing V on the keyboard. And now I can adjust the handles of this keyframe to modify my value curve. So if I go a little crazy and adjust this to be a weird shape, let's try to read this curve before I play the animation back. At this point, our dot will be on the left side of the screen. It'll ease into its motion and come up to a point of about 1100 pixels, so pretty far on the right side of the screen. But then you can see that our curve is now dropping down back to a lower value of around 1045 pixels, and then it comes back up to a resting point of 1150. So what we should see is that our dot travels to a certain point, comes back a little bit, and then finally comes to its resting point. Let's preview that animation. And sure enough, there it is right at the end. You can see that it does this little wiggle move before it comes to the last frame. Now I would not have been able to do this nearly as easily inside of the speed graph. If I switch back to my speed graph, you can see what that looks like. The reason why it's easier to do this type of motion inside of the value graph, because I can just grab the handles of the value graph and adjust them to whatever I want. Inside of the speed graph, it gets a little bit more tricky because you can't adjust the angle of the handle, just the height and the influence. I can actually look at both graphs at once if I click on Show Reference Graph. Now we can see the motion of our dot being represented by both graphs at the same time. So the baseline for our reference graph would be 0 pixels per second. And you can see that it speeds up, slows down a whole bunch until it comes to a negative speed, which is where the dot travels backwards, and then speeds up pretty quickly again and drops off to its resting point of 0. And on our value graph, we can see the same thing, just represented in a different way. Eases into its motion, gets to a point of 1130 pixels, backtracks down to about 1035, and then eases into its resting point of 1150. If I click and drag on this keyframe, you can see that both curves are updating at the same time. So if you're having trouble understanding what's happening between the two different graphs, I want to encourage you to just play around with it and try turning on the reference graph so you can see both types of graphs at the same time to really get a grasp on what's going on when you're adjusting these handles. Now, like I said before, 9 times out of 10, the speed graph does exactly what I need it to, and I don't need this extra control. It's only when I'm doing very specific types of animation that need a little bit more finessing that I'll use the value graph. So get in here, mess around with it, try to get a feel for both graph editors, and ask any questions if you're running into any kind of trouble. I can't stress the importance of this unit enough. Using the graph editor is the key to controlling your motion inside of After Effects. At this point, you need to get into the program and start messing around with the graph editor. Set up some shapes and animate them on the position, scale, and rotation values to see how the graph editor affects each one of those properties. Also, switch between the speed and the value graphs to see how those are different. If you have any questions, please leave a comment on the Ask Me Anything discussion, and rewatch this video if you need to. Then, post any of the experiments that you came up with while messing around with the graph editor.